Here is chapter 10, part 2, the 20th of March, Norwood and District Cottage Hospital. Having washed again but still looking bedraggled, Walter hobbled into the hospital 10 minutes before visiting hours. He paced the corridor, holding the bag Emily had given him. In his other hand, he held Kate's only childhood toy, her one-eyed teddy bear, rescued from the rubble. A fat, balding man in a white coat called out to him, "Inspector Thompson, would you like to come to this little office and sit down for a moment?" Walter extended his hands. "Yes, of course. Thank you so much for caring for my wife." The doctor stared at the desk and took a deep breath. "I'm very sorry, Inspector." "Sorry?" Walter dropped the bag. "Please accept my deepest sympathy. Mrs. Thompson did not make it through the night." Walter dashed out of the office and into the ward where the curtains were drawn around Kate's bed. The sister came out from behind the reception desk. "Inspector Thompson, I'm very sorry for your loss. Would you like to see your wife now?" His hands trembled as he pulled back the curtain. Kate looked serene, pale and beautiful. Her hair had been brushed and she wore a pure white gown. Walter scooped her up in his arms and held her. George took the staircase to the ward. He held a dozen daffodils in full bloom. He almost bashed into a man hurrying in the other direction. "Doctor?" The doctor did not reply, and George stopped and looked after him. His pulse beat double time and he dashed upstairs, passing the empty doctor's office. He halted and backed up to the office. There was a bag tipped over on the floor and a single sheet of paper on the desk. Kate's death certificate. Cause pneumonia. The staff nurse challenged George as he walked into the ward. He flashed his warrant card and handed her the flowers. "Could you give these to one of your patients? I've come for Mrs. Thompson." "Oh, thank goodness. Her husband's in there, I'm afraid." "I know, I've just found this." George held up the death certificate. "He won't put the body down." "Leave it all to me. I can suppose that as the certificate has been signed, we can take Mrs. Thompson to a chapel of rest." "Yes, of course." "Well, then I'll call Dickie Bird, the undertaker. He's a good friend and local." George waited outside the curtain. He watched the shadow of Walter holding Kate in his arms. Dickie, whose funeral parlour was situated on the same parade as Thompson's grocers, arrived. He shook George's hand and whispered, "Heavens above, I never thought I'd be burying Kate." The curtain opened and Walter emerged with Kate in his arms, draped in the white sheet. George touched his shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Walter." Walter nodded and went to walk away. "I'm taking her home, George." "Yes, of course. But let's take her the back way, 'cause Dickie's bought his ambulance." Dickie bowed his head. "We'll take the very best care of her, Walter. I promise you." George picked up Kate's teddy bear from the bed and used its arm to rub his eyes. He opened the back door for Walter so he could carry Kate through. Dickie did have an old ambulance rather than a hearse waiting outside. Walter got in the back and rested Kate on the stretcher. George returned to the sister to let her know what had happened. As he passed the empty doctor's office, he noticed the bag tipped on his side and a small round tin on the floor. In the wastepaper basket bin was an empty bottle of brandy. 12th of April, West Norwood Cemetery. Low grey clouds darkened the sky above the cemetery. Walter stood by Kate's grave, surrounded by a mist so dense it was not unlike fine rain. The other mourners had already left under a sea of black umbrellas. Bernie tugged Walter's soaking sleeve, but he did not move. 2 gravediggers sheltered under a large oak. An older man rested on his shovel. "This chap's not going anywhere anytime soon." "Cup of tea then, Dad, to give him a bit of time. Can't fill the hole in with him standing there like that." She had a good turnout, that nice lady from the shop. Haven't seen that many people for a funeral in a long time. Everyone came to their front garden gate with their hats off to show their respects. There were so many people they couldn't all get into the chapel. She was a lovely woman, generous to a fault, even with the rationing. What a flaming shame. George instructed the driver of Churchill's private car to take Emily and Bernie to the wake and then come back for him and Walter. As he waited, he wrestled in his head with the information the driver had reported about the doctor. Churchill had sent him to collect the doctor at his club, but the doctor was drunk and had to be taken home. The driver told George he had suggested the doctor call a colleague to attend to Mrs. Thompson, but he had dismissed him. The doctor had not arrived at the cottage hospital until 10 o'clock the next morning. George looked at the open grave and mumbled, "One day I'll have to tell him about this, but not today." 30th of June, Westminster, London. George unloaded Walter's gun and put the bullets into his jacket pocket. He slipped the gun back into Walter's holster, where it hung on the hook on the back of the door. Walter appeared from his bathroom wearing a towel. His features were lined with grief. He glanced in the mirror, picked up a hand towel resting on the bed and rubbed his face. George pulled the towel away from him. "Come on, Inspector. The old man will be ready in 15 minutes. They're having to meet in the Lords today." The House of Commons chamber had been destroyed in a bombing raid shortly after the one that had led to Kate's death. Walter and George stood by the great door while members of Parliament debated the progress of the war in the House of Lords. George played with the loose bullets in his pocket. He remained close by Walter's side. He covered shifts for him, unloaded the gun when he thought Walter was in danger of turning it on himself in his darkest hours. He gabbled on to fill the strained silence with Walter, who would sometimes reward him by nodding in recognition of something he said. "So, some good news at last, Walter. The Russians are going to fight on our side." Walter put his hand on George's arm to stop him talking. Churchill stood and placed his notes on the table of the House of Lords. "We have promised Russia whatever help we can. We've offered any technical or economic assistance in our power. We are resolved to destroy Hitler." George nudged Walter. "I wonder how many men they've got. The Russians, you know, it's a big country. Got to have more than us. If only the Americans would take our side." Churchill raised the level of his voice over the cries of "Hear, hear" from the members. "As I speak, German tanks are smashing into Russia. Minsk, which is over halfway to Moscow, has fallen. We are hoping the Russians can hold on until the snow comes, when the German soldiers and equipment, who are unsuited to the intense cold, will, I believe, run into difficulties." Walter was not listening. He glanced at a communiqué from the Secret Service. It read, "Operation Long Jump, latest informations. Germans train crack troops of different nationalities at their spy school, Lake Quentz, near Berlin. Recruits are undergoing parachute training." He folded the paper and handed it to George. George read the message 2 or 3 times, trying to make some sense of it. "What are we supposed to do? Station X tells us an attempt on the old man life is coming, but not enough bloody intelligence to do anything about it. If it's to be a sniper with a rifle, the old man can only rely on us to put ourselves between him and the bullet. I hear they're testing some new body armour, but it's very cumbersome." George turned the paper over in his hand, as if there might be a clue on the reverse. Walter looked up. "If it slows me up and I don't get to him in time, then what's the use? Besides, a bullet would be a blessed relief." George folded the note. "I think I might give it a go." 6th of July, Chequers, the official country house of the Prime Minister. In the great hall of the Tudor house, 41 miles from Downing Street, Churchill was having a crisis. Resting on the table next to the gramophone was a file marked "Top Secret." Walter slipped in the room and glanced at the document. The heading explained Churchill's despair. Convoy sunk in the Atlantic. Britain has 6 weeks of food left before the population begins to starve. Churchill ignored Walter and continued to parade up and down in his underpants. The old man's eyes were small red dots and his chubby pink face looked swollen. From a scratchy gramophone record, Harry Lauder echoed around the hall. Keep right on till the end of the road. Keep right on to the end. Right turn! Churchill marched to the far end of the hall, his pants beginning to slip down. Walter sat on a chair by the door and looked at the floor. Halt! Order arms! Churchill lifted an imaginary rifle from his shoulder. Attention! He stamped his feet, stood straight. Lauder sang on. Keep right on till the end of the road. Quick! March! The old man stepped up the pace. By the left, 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 left. A drip of water hung from his nose. He stomped past Walter, halted at the wall, did a smart about turn. The record stopped. Winston sang, Keep right on till the end of the road. Keep right on till the end. Walter put the stylus back on the spinning gramophone record, opened the door and stood guard outside. George joined him. Oh, bloody hell, what's up? The mad old man's marching again, isn't he? One of his black dog depressions? Yes, George, you go off duty. I'll see to him. Walter waited outside the door, preventing anyone entering, for a good hour until the frenzy subsided. He found the old man slumped in a chair. He summoned all his strength to carry him to his room and put him to bed. 31st of July, Berlin. In Berlin, the Germans were busy formulating plans to exterminate a whole race of people. The orders came from an evil man with poison in his heart. They were bland and did not mention murder or gassing, but the words total solution meant death for 6 million innocents. Order from Hermann Göring. I hereby charge you to carry out preparations for a total solution of the Jewish question in all the territories of Europe under German occupation. Submit to me as soon as possible a general plan for carrying out the desired final solution. 2nd to the 8th of August. A secret sea voyage from Chequers, England to Newfoundland, an independent island off the east coast of America. A month had passed since Churchill's depression. Come in, Thompson, I have news. He beckoned Walter close. He put his arm around his neck. You were right. President Roosevelt won't meet me publicly, but he will meet me in secret. I'm sure you've been talking to Mike Riley. He will meet me at sea. They sat together and planned the trip. It was the first time in weeks Churchill had smiled. George waited outside. Walter appeared after an hour holding his notebook full of plans for the clandestine meeting. George fell into step. Got a plan, Inspector? Are we going to see the Yanks? Walter tapped his notebook and smiled. Well, let's pray we get some help. We're not ready for war. We're short of food. We still haven't turned out sufficient guns, tanks or planes to take on the Nazis in Europe. If our American friends don't muck in, we'll be speaking German this time next year. The next day, Walter cracked open the heavy oak door of the great hall. Loud music from the gramophone hurt his ears. Churchill gave Walter one of his bewitching smiles. Morning, Thompson! He executed a smart about turn, fully dressed this time. Left, left, left. Walter sat on a wooden chair by the door and watched the old man on parade. Churchill shouted orders to himself and carried them out with military precision. He no longer seemed like a man marching alone. Walter felt the presence of a huge army at the Prime Minister's back. Is everything ready? Walter nodded. What time do we start? In about half an hour, sir. Oh, for God's sake! Is he going to march all the bloody way? George announced in a voice too loud for Walter's comfort. Mad. It's a damn good job no one else can see this nonsense. Has he got any pants on? George went to find his coat. At 1 p.m, Churchill appeared by the door, wearing his coat and hat. "Thompson, everything ready?" "Yes, of course, sir. We leave in about a quarter of an hour." In less than 5 minutes, Churchill bounded out of the building and jumped into the car. "The station, George, please." George pulled out of the drive. "Everyone's so excited. Do you really think the Americans will help us?" Churchill cleared his throat. "I have much to ask, George." As the train sped north through Scotland, Churchill turned to his scientific advisor, Lord Cherwell. "You're a brilliant mathematician. Answer me this. How many pints of champagne do you think I've drunk in the last 24 years at the rate of 1 pint a day?" Cherwell smiled. "Well, I suppose 8,760. Churchill chuckled. "And how many coaches like the one we're sitting in would be required to carry that amount of champagne?" "Well, it would only take up the part of one coach." Churchill feigned a boyish sulk. "Oh, that's disappointing. I'd hoped it would take up several coaches." George held open an umbrella for Churchill at Thurso Station. Winston smiled and quick marched along the platform, the pouring rain unable to dampen his spirit. Walter paused to survey the area. "Come along, Thompson. Next stage of our journey awaits. Our destroyer to join the battleship HMS Prince of Wales at Scapa Flow. Pick up the pace, man." Walter nodded, but his face remained neutral. Naval ratings whistled Churchill aboard the Prince of Wales. Admiral Tovey performed a perfect salute. "Welcome aboard, sir. President Roosevelt's advisor, Mr. Harry Hopkins, is waiting in the mess, where we have some rum to warm you." "Lead on, Admiral. Please lead on." On the bridge, Captain Phillips was on edge. "I want a minute-by-minute report from the radio room. We have a precious cargo aboard. Inspector Thompson assures us that German intelligence has not got wind of this, but there has been a great deal of U-boat activity." "Aye, aye, sir," replied his number one. The officers were aware of the significance of their mission, yet no one but the Admiral, the Captain, Churchill and Walter knew their final destination. The seas were pleasant and the sky was clearing. Walter retired to his cabin. He had already vetted the whole ship's company in advance, so there was nothing left for him to do. He sat at the small desk, staring through the porthole. An hour passed until he picked up a pen and played with it. He took a photograph of Kate out of his breast pocket and stood it up on the desk against the inkwell. His chest tightened and he suppressed the need to howl like a dog. He knew he teetered on the edge between sanity and madness. After another 2 hours, he took the pen and paper and again began to line them up in front of him. After another hour, he began to write. He screwed up the paper and threw it across the room. An hour later, he began again. Walter crumpled the paper. There was a tap on the door and George popped his head in. "Come on, Inspector. We're all waiting for you in the canteen. Your dinner's on the table." Walter put the pen down and stood to leave. "Would you think me crazy, George, if I told you I was trying to write a letter to Kate?" "No, Inspector. You might even find it therapeutic." After dinner, Walter paced the deck. He had 3 tight knots in his stomach. Fear for Stella, anxiety for Churchill, and guilt about Kate. George was also always close by. "Slow up, old chum. You can't walk across the Atlantic, you know." Walter gave him a half smile. "Hey, is that my old mate in there? May I accompany you round the boat?" George fell into step. They set off together in silence and halted outside Churchill's cabin. Churchill looked up at his porthole and gave a wave to his bodyguards outside on deck. The old man was reclining on his bunk, reading C.S. Forester's Captain Hornblower, R.N. George stopped by the rail. "Big ocean and big man we're going to ask a big favour of." Walter nodded and stared at the white froth as the ship cut through the sea. "He's a good man, Roosevelt, I hear, letting us borrow supplies to fight the Germans." As they passed Churchill's cabin again, he put down his book, stretched and yawned before wiggling his feet. He stepped out on deck and joined them in a stroll around the ship. "Attention!" signalled an officer as they approached a group of sailors. Churchill raised his hand. "No, no, carry on. I want to walk about without interfering. Allow the men to be at ease so I can have some personal contact with them." Later that evening, Churchill was dressing for dinner. He was comforted by the presence of his silent bodyguard. "I need to ask so much of the Americans. I think Mr. Roosevelt will help. I believe Britain and the United States have..." Churchill paused to look at Walter for assistance with his tie. "A special friendship. I pray this trip will be the first of many to visit our friends in America. I love this ship, you know. I feel that it's my ship." That's the end of chapter 10, part 2.